Welcome to the ICCS webinar series, and this is, of course, originally this is we will have a classroom at the National Yang Chartered University to host this seminar, but because of the COVID, we turn it into a fully online talk, and it's a great honor to have Dr. Jayde Roberts to share with us when the formal is potentially criminal, the logic, mutuality, and morality of informal street vending and heritage making in Yangon, Myanmar. So Dr. Jayde Lin Roberts is a senior lecturer at the School of Built Environment, UNSW. Dr. Roberts is an interdisciplinary scholar of the built environment who focuses on Asian cities. So she has completed her monograph, Mapping Chinese Rangoon, Place and Nation Among the Sino-Burmese, published by the University of Washington Press. I just checked on the Amazon. There's still copy on it, so you can go to you can go to check over it and ask your library to acquire a copy. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dr. Jayde Roberts. So Dr. Roberts, please.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm gonna first just, I clicked something and now I'm not sure if the share screen will still work. So let me do this real quick so that I don't have a problem later. Oh, come on. Oops, dang it. Okay, hold on. Okay, well, first, thank you, Desmond, while I'm clicking around like a fool. Hold on, let me see if I can make it work now.
Yes, we've seen an island.
Okay, all right, yep. Good. Here's the slide. All right. So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with everyone. It looks like it's a fairly small group, so I'm hoping that you'll feel comfortable interjecting questions, or if you want to save them until the end, that's fine as well. I wish I could go to Taipei, but nobody's traveling these days. And I just want to sort of put out a good thought out there and hope that everyone everywhere will soon be able to live safely and healthfully, and that we're learning the important lessons we need to learn in order to better take care of all beings, not just human beings. So the title of the talk, Desmond has already shared with you. I've changed it a little bit. So I'll get to the subtitle in a minute. The title is When the Formal is Potentially Criminal, because I want to call into question broadly accepted notions about the built environment, about urban governance, that would equate formal with order, reason, beauty, and also with modernity, with the official, with the lawful, and in the global aid and development industry that has strongly affected Myanmar for about 10 years, it is associated with good governance. I also put formal with criminal because unlike Taiwan, rule of law has not been the norm in Burma or Myanmar. How the military government has applied the law since the 1960s has been inconsistent, usually illegitimate, and often unlawful, if not downright criminal. That is, what becomes formalized as an official part of a system or a regulation is not necessarily more benign. Formalization has criminalized aspects or practices that are commonly accepted in Burma, in Burmese society. And some of these practices, such as informal relationships and street vending, have been integral to Burmese society. These are the practices that have enabled different populations to overcome both human-made and natural disasters. I open with this photograph as a provocation. And I'd like everybody to look at it carefully. Since you're all staring at screens, it should work quite nicely. Okay, so what is this? Where is it? And would you call this a street vendor or a street stall?
It looks like a corner store.
Yeah, yep, like a corner store, right? So what is, for me, when I was walking around Yangon, and actually almost everybody I talked to, or actually everybody that I asked, there is an impressive sense of order here, right? It's visually very appealing. This man here in the blue, and I've blocked out his face because everything is potentially dangerous these days. He's organized his products very tidily. And you can see that the glass is shiny. So he's cleaning the glass at least every day, because Yangon is a very dusty city. If you went one day, it'd be all like coated. All right. So it looks like a corner store. It looks fairly official, but actually he has no official permission to run this business. It's a corner store of sorts. It occupies the northwest corner of a building, and it's only about 5 by 7 feet in the footprint in plan. It's a little notch in the corner of a colonial era building, and this man in blue found it abandoned after World War II. During our interview, he said that after the war ended, he waited to see if anybody would come back and reclaim their store, but nobody came. So he cut the lock and he started operating his own business. So it's a little pharmacy right in the heart of Chinatown. So in Myanmar, the logic of the everyday is often not readable to the visitor. Had I not talked to him, I wouldn't have known that he's actually not legally allowed to operate this business. What constitutes the formal, informal, ethical, unethical, legitimate, and illegitimate requires patient and sympathetic observation. I should note that I changed the subtitle a little bit. It became too unwieldy as I was preparing the presentation to talk about street vending and heritage making. So instead, I'm focusing on street vending and informal life in Yangon. This typical street scene here in the photograph might seem similar or familiar to anyone who has lived in or traveled through Southeast Asia, or even parts of East Asia. But even compared to other cities in neighboring countries such as Thailand or India, there are significant differences. These differences have to be considered because I'd like to be a part of the project to decolonize urban studies and Asia and area studies. The differences in history and place are not deviations that can be put aside to interpret the local phenomenon. They constitute parts of the local everyday life that can yield new insights if we don't apply pre-existing frameworks or theories too quickly. Not to abandon theory, but to be very reflexive in how we use them. So before I focus on the logic, mutuality, and ethics of street vending and informal life in Myanmar, we need to quickly review the history of Myanmar and Yangon. This context is important. Burma was colonized by the British through a series of 3 Anglo-Burmese wars in 1824, 1852, and 1885. Before the English East India Company took the territory that we call Burma or Myanmar today, it was a mosaic of kingdoms and princely states that at times allied with each other to fight a common enemy, such as the British, or the French, or the Siam Thai. But at times they also fought each other in order to expand their own empires, right? So like the Burman Empire or the Kachin princely states. The Burman often dominated this region in history. So if you can see my mouse, the central Burman plain is where the Burma lived. And amongst Burma studies scholars, we usually say Burman, but more recently, people have been calling it Bamar, spelling it B-A-M-A-R, to mimic the Burmese. The contemporary nation state is known as Burma and Myanmar because of this ethnic group. Today, the Burma are about 70% of the total population. And the British called the central area Ministerial Burma and ruled it directly through their officials. And these officials came from the UK, well, what we call the UK now, and from India. However, within this territory, there are also the Karen, Kachin, Shan, Chin, and other ethnic groups called the Dayan Da in Burmese. And this Dayan Da is usually translated as ethnic nationalities. If you're trying to think of something that is similar, you can think of Minzu in China. These different groups of people speak different languages, maintain different practices that remain distinguishable despite the attempts of the state to Burmanize all populations within this territorial boundary. According to the official categorization put forth by the government, there are 135 ethnic nationalities. And this has not been consistent, but this is, for the past 20, 30 years, actually 30, 40 years, it's been 135. These Dayan Da largely live in this area. Usually in Burma studies, we call it the horseshoe, and the British called this the frontier regions. This was ruled indirectly via the local chieftains or the local princes. Based on my, let's see, so although we're not talking about ethnicity today, it's important to note this ethnic diversity in Burma because it is central to Burma's history as a nation state. Since the country declared its independence from the British in 1948, different ethnic groups have fought against the centralizing efforts of the Burman majority and the Burman-dominated military. And I have here words like Burma, Myanmar, Rangoon, Yangon, because it could be really confusing for people who aren't in Burma studies. There were times wherein scholars and activists said, well, we're only going to say Burma because we're not going to support the military. But after 2012, when reforms started happening, everybody's like, okay, fine, we can say Myanmar because they're doing better. With the military coup, I've noticed that some scholars are going back to Burma rather than Myanmar as the term they choose to use. Similarly, for Rangoon and Yangon, they refer to the same city. And historically, the ya in Yangon was a ra. So both are correct. You might meet people who are saying, no, Rangoon's wrong and it's colonial. Actually, back then, that was the right way to say it. So names are problematic when you do Burma studies. All right, so as we've seen in headlines like this one, Myanmar is in a crisis right now. The military instigated a coup d'etat on the 1st of February in 2021, this year, and they've been unwilling to concede that the people in Myanmar are not behind them. They don't support the Tamada, the military. And in the escalating violence, the people in the central area of Burma, central Burma, have gotten a taste of what the ethnic minorities, such as the Chin in this news story, or the Karen and the Kachin, in their areas, they've suffered this kind of direct military assault for decades. So, yeah. And I'm sure you've seen news about Burma, so I won't put up any of the horrible pictures. I'm also choosing not to put up those pictures because it's important for us to pay attention. But when we're observing from afar, I feel like it's unwise to comment or to share images or stories that we can't verify and be absolutely confident about. There's quite a bit of history of sensationalization with the news in Myanmar and amongst Myanmar studies pundits. So it's a difficult situation. But the most recent coup d'etat sits in a history of coups and military rule that strongly affects life in Myanmar. So this is a timeline that I made during my PhD fieldwork, which ended in 2009. And originally it focused on the Myndian Huaren, the Chinese people of Chinese descent in Myanmar. But I think it's appropriate today because the curve that I drew showing the changes can be applied to Burma more generally and it's visually more interesting than a list. Okay. So I've added the other events that weren't originally in the graph in the golden yellow. So you see that the country became independent in 1948, and there was a coup d'etat, the first one in 1958. It wasn't violent. UNU agreed to step down. Then UNU won the election, but then the military was like, nope, nope, nope. And then they came back in 1962. From about 62 to 1988, some scholars say it was a military government. Some say, no, strictly speaking, it wasn't, because it was a party, the Socialist Program Party, but the generals were in charge. So the uprising, the popular democratic uprising, happened in 1988. It was crushed by the military. The military held an election in 1990 and expected to win, but they didn't. So they didn't let the National League of Democracy for Democracy come to power. From 1990 to about 2011, it was the Slork SPDC military junta. Zoom has blocked my, oh, here we go. There, that's better. All right. So in the past 75 years, Myanmar has undergone multiple economic and political ruptures, with each new government bringing new political, economic, and even naming systems. So I talked about that a little bit earlier. Episodic change has been the norm rather than the exception. And the residents of Yangon and throughout Burma have referred to their own history in periods. So the first period was colonial rule until 1947, so 1852 to 1947 for Yangon. Then UNU's period from 1948 to 62. Then General Ne Win's period, or the Burma Socialist Program Party period, from 62 to 88. Then the military junta from 88 to 2011. The so-called transition from 2011 to 2021, and now the coup d'etat period. I also need to note that in 2007, there was a monks' protest. Some of you might know of this. Lots of people were killed. A Japanese journalist was killed, so the world paid more attention. Then 2018, there was a huge cyclone that devastated southern Burma. And that's actually when international actors and aid agencies came into play. And then the reform that started in 2011. So after the military proclaimed itself to be a civilian government and initiated national reform, the world was reintroduced to Burma. After 2011, globalized circuits of development expertise, both in urban and rural areas, have swept into the country, and they offered universalized solutions with little acknowledgement of local practices and conceptions of well-being. Macro-level policies based on development in the Anglophone and Japanese worlds have been dispensed as best practices with little time to adjust for local differences. So for Yangon, there's a 2040 master plan, and it was drawn by the Japan International Cooperation Agency. This plan has become the default blueprint for the city, even though some problems have already been identified. So from 2011 onwards, Myanmar has been undergoing a process of formalization on all fronts. This formalization has been funded by international donors, and most initiatives have emphasized transparency, accountability, and rule of law without much effort to understand how local life actually works. The local logic of mutuality, reciprocity, and bounded circles of accountability have been very important. The pursuit of formalization and transparency has rendered everyday and mutual practices more legible to the state. Through requirements to register businesses and organizations, to monitor streets, to the installation of cameras for smart city initiatives that happened in Yangon and Mandalay, everyday life is more easily policed. So here are some pictures from Facebook where my friends have been sharing news about the atrocities of the military, but also some enduring practices of mutual help, of care. And you can see in the left picture, so this is in Myitkyina in Kachin State. And the sign here says, if you have extra, donate it. And if you need something, take it. Okay, it's actually like those who have extra, please donate. Those who need it, take. So this is a very common practice. The two pictures down here are two other locations where this has happened. But because the state is now more able to police and track, this very innocuous everyday self-help and mutual care is deemed illegal. And the police arrested 11 young people for bringing out food and trying to help. I'm currently revising an article about Nalemu, and the title is something like Myanmar's hidden in plain sight social infrastructure. Nalemu is a Burmese word, and it is a set of relational practices that constitutes the hidden in plain sight social infrastructure in Myanmar. So 2 slides ago, I talked about the ups and downs in Myanmar's history. Successive periods have brought different leadership, regulation, governments, and economic systems. They've also brought violence and suppression. So how have Myanmar people managed to survive, and not just survive, improve their lives despite these ruptures, these frequent ruptures? Nalemu in the Myanmar English Dictionary is translated as, quote, understanding of a situation, understanding between persons or sides, and on the understanding, meaning you do something based on the understanding of XYZ. So Nalemu is the noun form of the verb nale, to understand, to know, to comprehend. This concept is situated and achieved between 2 actors, not independent of context. It's always negotiating power that establishes relations of mutuality, obligation, and reciprocity between individuals and groups. It enables access to goods and services and recognition, and it facilitates interactions with the state. It's a dynamic set of practice that work across different scales, from the intimate to the public, which can produce social and economic value horizontally through rhizomatic and decentralized networks, and vertically through hierarchies. If we think about it, if we try to compare it to Chinese culture, we can see a similar phenomenon in Guanxi, in the practice of Guanxi. Thoughtful scholars such as Mayfair Yang have studied Guanxi and Guanxi Xue in depth. So I'm borrowing from her work and the work of others. And this is most likely nothing new to most people here today, but let me just lay it all out because I'm making a comparison here. The Chinese word Guanxi means mutual relationship, a connection between people or things, or having a concern with something or someone, or having a bearing on something. As a set of practices, Guanxi operates through a process of exchanges intended to build long-term relationships that follow implicit social norms, such as 信用, trustworthiness, 人情, which is the acceptable interpersonal behavior, and they're maintained through trust, mutual obligation, and reciprocity. Although Guanxi is easily conflated with corruption and bribery, it is no more equivalent to corruption than social drinking is to drunkenness. So I'm quoting from not only Mayfair Yang, but another scholar named Qi and Ambler. Deployed as a rent-seeking practice, Guanxi can play on asymmetrical relations to achieve selfish objectives. But as a form of favor-seeking, it's been shown to develop trust and facilitate exchanges to benefit both parties. Trust is an integral aspect of Guanxi, which serves as a form of insurance by placing the reputation of the relevant parties at stake and thereby reducing fraud. In addition, renqing as the dynamic force behind Guanxi renders an emotional bond and a sense of indebtedness. And this can moderate behavior by making it difficult for somebody to decline the request for help or a failure to repay a debt of renqing. So I'm quoting from Mayfair Yang again. Guanxi practices constitute an alternative and even subversive realm of operations, weaving webs of personal relationships that eschew universalistic and transcendental morality, and instead is guided by a set of situational and relational ethics. So I'm talking a lot about relations and relational ethics and relational economy. So Nalemu, like Guanxi, operates through implicit relations that require intimate knowledge of and general abidance by local norms. It's the understanding of a situation between relevant parties, which enables action to be taken based on that understanding. This comprehension is built on long-term interactions which cultivate and maintain a sense of mutuality, obligation, and reciprocity between individuals that is context-specific and largely illegible to non-participants. The actors involved must see themselves as somehow relevant to each other and thereby invest in the relationship through the giving and receiving of understanding. Compared to the concept of Guanxi, Nalemu is similar to renqing. It's the animating force that compels action. The giving of understanding, Nalebede, generates a renqing debt that must be repaid if one is to maintain one's standing within the local society or to maintain power within an institution. This exchange can produce an affective bond that calls on the feeling of anade to moderate the behavior. And anade in Burmese or in Burmese society is a little bit like 不好意思, well, quite a bit like 不好意思 in Chinese culture. And anade is often translated as embarrassment. It's a cultural value in Burma that discourages asserting oneself in human relations based on the fear of causing offense or producing distress or losing face. It encourages a strong sense of consideration for others and significantly shapes interpersonal relationships. So in my comparison of Chinese and Myanmar cultural practices, both anade and nalemu map onto renqing as the act or feeling that encourages mutuality. A lot of text here. With one last slide with a lot of text. All right. So in my work to analyze everyday practices in Myanmar, I also draw on intimate economies as presented by Ara Wilson in her book, The Intimate Economies of Bangkok, Tomboys, Tycoons, and Avon Ladies in the Global City. Often in the analysis of modernization, intimacy is used as a convenient way to demarcate the distinction between public, private, and local and global. In these uses, the intimate stands apart from the state and the market. It presupposes that intimacy belongs to the local level or to the private sphere. In contrast, feminist and queer scholars, such as Wilson, have used intimacy as an analytical device to counter the understanding of the intimate as a private local realm that is altered when it is penetrated by external forces such as global capitalism. Their work frames intimacy itself as the domain of power in modern societies. Intimate relations are realized through larger relays of power, and analyses of intimacy demonstrate how larger structural forces produce private, proximate, and personal domains and distribute resources unequally across differently valued relations. The entrenched binaries of public-private, local-global, personal, political were carved out by economic, political, and intellectual currents and realized in built form when we think about the city. Capitalist modernity and its intellectual advocates produce the common sense view that the private, domestic, and feminine sphere is non-productive and economically irrelevant. But Wilson and others argue that the separation of public and private spheres constitutes modernity. This was not there before modernity. And this is important because Nalemu doesn't work in the sort of protest public fora. It works through implicit, unstated relationships that might seem purely private. Wilson and other scholars argue that intimacy is a public and political mode of relationship that was privatized in the 20th century liberal society, and that privatization has valorized normative forms of domestic intimacy and eroded the intimacy of public democratic life. This interrogation of intimacy can illuminate the broad operations of political economy, labor, and governmentality. Therefore, in relation to globalization, quote, the intimate functions not as an opposite to the global, but as its corrective. So I'm using Wilson and scholars like her to resist forms of knowledge that perpetuate or rationalize global inequality, and use the idea of intimacy as a rubric because it's flexible, provisional, and it emphasizes linkages across what are understood to be distinct realms. It allows us to look at relational life. And in my analysis, relational life is key in Myanmar. By looking at street vending as intimate economies or forms of intimate labor, we can also pay attention to how intimate labor is embedded in structures. But it's not just a mechanism for producing inequalities. It can also serve as an instrument for self-actualization and self-valuation. Intimate labor refers to the work of forging, sustaining, nurturing, and maintaining interpersonal ties, and involves some level of dependency and trust. Like informality, intimacy is a system of relations, which responds to urgent needs at a given moment, but also shifts according to as needs change. Informality and intimacy can work at and across different scales, but the relationships are always present. Oops. Relationships and connections are key in my examination of street vending. These connections are located in specific places, but they're not confined to those locations. Sometimes when people talk about intimacy in place studies, there's a sense that the place is static, but it's not. Place, it can be stretched and nested and moved without losing its meaning. So this is a picture I took at an official night market that was established by the Yangon city government in 2015. And this street is next to the largest park in downtown Yangon called Mahabandula Garden. It's at the center of the city and it's in front of City Hall. The vendor with the white sign here, that sign says, top of 40th Street Burmese rice shop. 40th Street is over 10 blocks from this garden. So this business has been displaced and it's trying to maintain its identity and its clientele by identifying itself as the shop that was once at the top of 40th Street. Clearly, it had a very loyal clientele and hopes to draw those same patrons to this new location. There were many stalls that identified themselves by their original locations and their usual spots before they were forced to move to this street by Mahabandula Park. Yangon is comprised of 33 townships, and 40th Street is not even in the same township as this garden. You can see that there are many people of all ages eating at these stalls. Unfortunately, in the picture that I took, you can't see the vendors, but most often the vendors are families, sometimes extended families with everybody pitching in. So like the mother and father would be cooking and the kids would be running around, picking up and delivering dishes. They generally don't hire help. They manage everything themselves, from sourcing the veggies and the meat to prepping and cooking and serving and cleaning up. So it is an intimate family unit in the marketplace, generating income for themselves, but also their work contributes to the economic life in the city. Before Yangon's municipal and regional governments relocated vendors, vendors knew the people in their neighborhoods intimately. This is a picture from a typical morning market on the left. And the one on the right is, they call themselves a newsstand. It was just a little table with newspapers. And these stalls were identified by the streets they were located on. So when I was doing my field work, if I asked, where can I buy something? People always told me to go to the upper block of this street or the corner of this street and that street. They weren't named. You just had to know the location. This is from the street I lived on between 2007 and 2008. These sellers were there every morning, very early in the morning. And I took this around 7 a.m. They were generally gone by 9 a.m. because then the fruit and vegetable sellers would come. So they had to clear out. Then the guy on the right over here is making ijakwe. And ijakwe is the Burmese way of saying yojakwe or youtiao. As a spatial ethnographer, I'm dedicated to doing research inductively from the ground up. So I want to read you a passage from my field notes that resulted from walking streets, the same streets every day. So this is one of the streets I walked on every day. Most of these women came from the other side of the Yangon River. They carried their baskets on their heads to get to the market. Their temporary stalls are just a few banana leaves, a piece of cardboard, or the bare ground. They quickly set themselves up and call out dia, 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 which means 100, or ngaze, 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 meaning 50. These prices refer to the standard Burmese measurements, such as one vis, that's a volume or a weight, one bunch or one basket. That confused me for months. I was like, why are they just calling out numbers? What are they selling? Nimale, this is Burmese for little sister. You weren't here yesterday. Help us out today. You need some spinach, cauliflower? Then I say, I was away. How much is the cauliflower? 150 per head. But it was only 100 last time. Prices have gone up recently. I'll give it to you for 130. Is it fresh? Of course it is. Okay, I'll take this one. These daily interactions helped me to establish a relationship with the local vendors. I had to be known to them, to be of some use to them as a regular customer before I could learn about their situation. Back then, hawkers were implicitly, not explicitly, implicitly allowed to sell food and other goods on the sidewalks until the regional and municipal governments of Yangon prohibited street vending along the 11 major streets in December 2016. Until that date, vendors had long established themselves along streets and street corners and made particular streets popular as night markets. Everyone knew about the night market on Mahabandula Road in Chinatown, called Diotdan in Burmese. Many vendors had built up a steady clientele, and some even became famous, such as the Shuiyin A. Shuiyin A is a cold dessert in a light syrup that you find in many Southeast Asian countries. It's got like little green bits and little balls and ice. So there's a Shrayin A seller at the corner of 26th Street and Mahapandula Street who'd been selling in that location for over 20 years. These nearly permanent vendors had built up Nalemu agreements with neighboring vendors and nearby brick and mortar shops so that their locations were secure through mutual monitoring. Some vendors had to pay fees to the brick and mortar shops, while others had to pay ward or township officials who would informally collect quote unquote fees. In one of my interviews, somebody said to me, people, quote, people pay fees to the official when he's not in uniform. And when the official is about to come in uniform for an official inspection, people know that they must not be there. So people are paying for information. Similarly, so this is a case where the formal is criminal, right? You know that when he's in uniform, you should be gone, but you pay him through Nalemu informally when he's just in his everyday shirt and longji. Longji is the Burmese sarong, like this guy is wearing. Similarly, vendors have agreements, Nalemu agreements among themselves. Within a given block, vendors know who sells where, and they respect each other's territories. I'm not saying that there's never conflict, but there's a sense that this is how things work. Those who are very well established are thought to own, quote unquote, own their businesses, which include parts of the sidewalk they occupy. And profitable stalls can even sell their businesses and their locations to others. Based on hearsay, when I was interviewing people, they said that well-known vendors in most popular market areas could sell their businesses for 3 million jat. So that's about 2,300 US dollars. And the sale doesn't come with a legal right to that space, but people still buy and sell businesses and locations in this way. All of the buying and selling is based on personal relationships and mutual trust because there's no external body or reliable law to mediate the process or to serve as insurance against uncertainties. And you could say that this is wrong, right? Because you should have more insurance, but the state has proven itself to be fickle and unreliable repeatedly. So this system has worked better. This Nalemu system has worked better. This Nalemu-based way of doing business and living in the city was threatened by the post-2011 government under U Thein Sein because there was a push to modernize Yangon. Then it was further threatened after 2015 because the popularly elected government led by the National League for Democracy wanted to further modernize and really promoted rule of law. In December 2016, Yangon's chief minister, Phyo Min Thein, prohibited street vending. He stated, quote, in downtown Yangon, traffic is congested and it's difficult to walk on sidewalks. The Strand night market is one of our first solutions to this problem. Now there's a designated place where vendors can open their stalls. The citizens of Yangon can freely and safely use the sidewalks. So this is Mahabandula Street. This is actually the least, not the least, the middle in terms of popularity is like in the middle range in terms of stalls. Then there's another area that is used to be jam-packed at night, but now no longer exists. In the news and public announcements, there were some discussions about improving hygiene and food safety, but the Yangon regional government removed vendors from the arterial roads to make more parking spaces. They banned street vending on Noyata, Bojok, Mahamadula, Bansodan, Merchant, Shredagon, Pagoda, Sule Pagoda, Latha, and Lamador, and Pongji roads because the authority saw street vendors as a major contributor to traffic congestion. That was not the case, but that's what they thought. This is the Strand night market when it first opened. It does not look like this anymore. The government set it up in December 2016. I took this picture within the first 2 or 3 weeks. So people were still excited about it and they went to check it out. It sits in the middle of 8 lanes of traffic. I think that's pretty clear in the picture. So 4 lanes of traffic on each side. And there's only one regulated or protected crossing for the entire 10 blocks. So there's no way to cross this road. You just gotta run at night. So when the night market first opened, people checked it out. Even though it was hard to get to, it was lively for a while. People were curious. And the white cars that you see, those are taxis. Most taxis in Yangon are white. So it was safer to take a taxi to come to check out this market because there aren't usually that many taxis on this road. There's no longitudinal data to allow me to compare clientele and costs before and after this forced relocation of street stalls. But anecdotal evidence suggests that people first came because they were curious and no longer frequent this market. When I've checked myself, it's a pretty dead night market. And then during COVID-19, they had to close down. And now it's, as far as I know, it's not operational anymore. Before street vending was banned on the main streets, the municipal government tried to count all of the vendors in the city and came up with a figure of 6,000 officially registered vendors. Out of the 6,000, only 1,600 were given plots in the new night market, in the new Strand night market. So this market is a stretch of numbered lots. Hopefully you can see that in my picture here. The yellow is the boundary. So here's one spot and another spot. Officially, the 1,600 vendors were each given a registration card, assigned a numbered lot. The lot size was either 32, 36, or 64 square feet, and they were restricted to selling between 3 p.m. and 11 p.m. But that's in 2 shifts, a late afternoon market from 3 to 7, and then a night market from 7 to 11. So this is a sign here telling you when the night market is operational. The vendors were also provided with piped water. So this here is the pipe. So he's washing dishes towards the end of the night market. But this water is not potable. It's only good for washing dishes. They were also given a garbage collection and some new public toilets, like their mobile public toilets that JICA put in. Vendors were also supposed to pay 300 jat per day for the use of the larger lots and 150 jat for the smaller lots, which is really nothing. It's not much at all. That's less than $1. But they were also supposed to pay 7,000 jat per month for electricity, and the electricity usage fees were waived until further notice. So there was a lot of confusion when I talked to the vendors. They weren't sure when they were supposed to pay, who's collecting the money. The selected 1,600 vendors were told to move to their specified lots on Strand Road during the 3rd week of November, while the remaining 4,400 sellers who did not get any lots were told, you have to fend for yourself, figure it out. These 4,000 so vendors who were not given a space in the night market were told to negotiate with local property owners in order to sell on the smaller side streets. So the formal official system made these guys that you see in the picture here more illegal because they somehow have to just negotiate with the people who live near those streets or the local ward official. U Nang U, a member of the parliament representing Babeda Township, stated, quote, "When the plan is initiated, the inner streets will be full of vendors. I'm not sure whether residents will accept that or not," unquote. The excluded vendors were essentially told to fall back on Nalemu, the old informal system, despite the government's public declaration that an official and more modern and systematic way for vendors had been established. This effort to formalize and regulate street vending not only excluded the majority of Yangon's hawkers, leaving them little choice but to break the new rule, it also forcefully relocated 1,600 vendors away from their established neighborhoods where they had a dependable clientele. So I took these pictures before 2016 on the smaller secondary and tertiary streets. Yangon's downtown is a gridiron, a very clearly demarcated streets with a hierarchy. The wider streets are the more important ones and the narrow streets are the less important ones. These pictures were taken on the 50 and 25-foot wide streets, so the tertiary and secondary streets. And the one on the top left shows how vendors store their carts and tents. The equipment was stored on streets that were the backs of businesses or where buildings were unoccupied. So they just squatted, they just took the space. Most of the time, if it was an unoccupied business, nobody bothered them. But if there was a business or a residence nearby, they had to pay a small fee to that local resident. In 2016, by the fourth week of November, the excluded vendors publicly protested via a press conference, saying that the city government prioritized rich vendors. And the vendors defined the rich vendors as those that had gotten the good plots in the Strand Road night market. Their previous Nalemu system, based on years of mutual monitoring and accommodation in established locations, had been undermined by official regulations that not only made no space for them, but weakened their ability to negotiate for vending spaces by explicitly defining them as illegal traders. By January 2017, vendors that were given spaces in the night market also complained because business was bad. The forced relocation had increased their transportation and storage costs, and this is through my interviews. And they also lost customers. So the truck on the left shows you that before they went close to their residences or some other way of storing their goods, so it was easier to set up. When I interviewed them, they said, well, now I have to hire a truck and get somebody to help me to move everything to Strand Road. And Strand Road is really in the middle, at the edge of the downtown core. There's no reason to go there unless you're going to a shipping container. One of the two vendors who are middle-aged, two female vendors who sell noodles, told me that their former customers or their old customers rarely came anymore because it was too difficult to cross Strand Road, especially if the customers are old or have children. So most people wouldn't cross the street with their kids. A newspaper reporter, Su Myat-mon, wrote that a hawker had personally witnessed 3 accidents near her stall in 2017. In a number of news articles by Frontier, 11 Myanmar, and Myanmar Times, reporters documented the rising sense of inequity with statements such as, quote, we used to have regular customers, but they don't come anymore. We don't want to sell here, unquote. Another quote, sales have been very bad from opening day, unquote. Others said that vendors had achieved preferential treatment because those hawkers were given larger stalls in Lhasa Township, where they remained closer to the old Mahabandula Road night market and therefore have better business. Notably, the only official organization that I saw on Strand Road, the CBIN is the municipal government, had set up one green tent as their official location to monitor sales. And they were supposed to check that everybody had the proper ID and were paying fees. But the vendors that I talked to said it was very unclear. On January 18th, street vendors, including those who did not get a stall in the new night market, And those who had a spot but were unhappy about their location protested. They marched from Modin Bridge. So this picture is Modin Bridge in Lamadaw Township to City Hall. So this is the only protected crossing that I had alluded to earlier. They asked the regional government to meet and speak with them about their concerns. One of the organizers of the protests, Go Aung Aung, said, quote, "The government do as they want without looking at the poor people. We are not privileged people, and the government needs to think about our lives and how we can survive," unquote. These vendors confronted the regional government because the new government led by the National League for Democracy was supposed to be a government of the people, but seemed once again to privilege the rich. Vendors saw themselves as unfairly marginalized. They asked the new civilian government to give them what they are entitled to based on Nalemu, the mutual understanding and relations that is the cultural norm in Myanmar. In their effort to control vendors, the state dealt with Nalemu as informal, personal, and undisciplined actions that must be regulated away, rather than as long-standing relational practices for negotiating power. Nalemu works from the intimate scale of one person to another, to an intermediate scale of one business or organization to another, and then all the way up to interactions with the state. In the Nalemu system, all encounters are negotiations with the understanding that current negotiations give rise to the possibility of future negotiations. It is a sort of investment in the future, a way to mitigate risk. Those of you familiar with the literature on urban informality will know this quote. It's from Roy and Al-Sayad. "Informality is a process of structuration that constitutes the rules of the game, determining the nature of transactions between individuals and institutions and within institutions. If informality operates through the fixing of value, if formality operates through the fixing of value, including the mapping of spatial value, then informality operates through the constant negotiability of value and the unmapping of space." So at the scale of cities, informality is an organizing urban logic. It's a deregulated rather than an unregulated system, which embodies a complex continuum of legality and illegality. And I've already told you about this photograph, right? That he would be, most people thought he was formal and official, but he wasn't. And I took this picture when I was doing a research project for the Yangon city government. And the officials who worked with me didn't have a problem with this man operating his business for this long, since World War II, without official permission. So I'm showing you this picture because the municipal officials said they understood, they nalede, why people run business in this way. They know that it's often the only way people can make a living. The municipal officials also know that rules are not applied consistently. They're different in different contexts, and some officials take bribes. So the Yangon city government people know that there's some of their colleagues take bribes, and that laws and regulations might be in the books, but they are not applied in accordance to what is written, or they don't match up with the common practices and accepted norms. Therefore, street vending in Yangon is a deregulated economy that relies on mutual understanding and relational negotiations. It can operate at the scale of the intimate, as I saw on this street with this vendor here. He knew all the kids, and kids knew that he would come when they were getting out of school. He sells an ice cream-like treat. And the shop owners on the street knew him. And he would say like, "Oh, you're home from school," right? So it's a personal relationship. The intimate and informal are systems of relations between discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, and scientific statements, such as discourses about hygiene and food safety. The intimate and informal respond to an urgent need at a given moment, but also shift accordingly as needs change. This protean quality is difficult to regulate, difficult to control, but its illegibility to the state does not render it unsystematic. It has a logic of its own that has and continues to enable the pursuit of basic livelihood and more aspirational betterment in Myanmar. My research suggests that Nalemu is a set of practices that creates a system of relations across scales. As I've already said, it operates at the most intimate all the way up to the state. For example, Myanmar people talk about how husbands and wives need Nalemu, that they need this Nalemu to stay married. It also operates at the scale of the street or the neighborhood where neighbors accommodate each other by turning a blind eye when a neighbor sets up a shop in the stairwell or in the front of their apartment. In addition, it operates at the less familiar scale of larger cities where people tolerate inconveniences, such as vendors occupying sidewalk space. So that's this picture here. But also, these same vendors that occupy sidewalk space also provide convenience and cheap food at a close distance. Finally, Nalemu operates at the scale of the state, wherein implicit relations can facilitate access to the state or diminish the punishment should somebody or some business be deemed to be breaking the law. At the largest scale of Nalemu, as a means to access the state, though, this level of Nalemu is more problematic because it's vulnerable to corruption. But this is only one aspect of Nalemu, and the entire system should not be rendered illegal in the name of good governance or transparency. With the return of the military with the coup this year, the 10 years of reform between 2011 and 2021 are being questioned because that period was supposed to be one in which Burma rejoined the world and became a more rational or formal state. And international aid agencies and all sorts of bodies came in to promote accountability by increasing transparency. That was supposed to minimize corruption. But this effort to increase transparency has rendered everyday Burmese people more vulnerable. Non-governmental organizations were forced to register their organizations. People became more, bank accounts became more normal. Before 2011, I knew very few people who had any bank accounts because nobody trusted the bank. There was a series of demonetization, so nobody was foolish enough to put their money in the bank. After transition started, people started thinking they could put money in the bank, but if you are following the news about Burma now, they can't get cash out because their money is stuck in the bank and the ATMs only operate for certain hours and you can only take out something like 3 lakh at a time. Also, during this so-called transition, to make everything more formal and transparent and thereby somehow less corrupt, mobile phones are registered. So now it's easier to track what people are doing. There was also a push to clearly and consistently document businesses and other activities, and all of this has made it easier for policing. And I'm showing you this picture because this is a street vendor. Hopefully you've been reading the little text there from Facebook. She sells fruit. She's in Monua. And when the young protesters, so you can tell they're protesters because they're wearing white helmets, when the protesters came out to protest, she decided to feed them. Because she did that, a policewoman arrested her, put her in jail. Luckily, this image became so popular that everybody was up and protested. So she was released. And then some rich guy decided that she was so wonderful, he was going to give her a house and a piece of land. This was very early on. This was March. So these informal practices are integral to their lives and have sustained Myanmar people for decades. And I wonder what harm will continue to be done in the name of formalization and formal ways or name of a rule of law, because the state, as run by the military, has seen the people of Myanmar as potential enemies rather than constituents or their own people. That's it for today.